Commander Vextha stared at the empty screen in front of him. For 300 years, the farming world of New Kepler had sent weekly reports to the Galactic Monitoring Station. Every 7 days, the same message came through space telling them about crop yields, weather patterns, and the lives of 2,300,000 people who called that green world home. Today, there was nothing. Vextha pressed the communication button with one of his 4 arms. His species, the Karathi, had been watching over this part of the galaxy for longer than most civilizations had existed. They knew when something was wrong. The silence from New Kepler was not just unusual. It was terrifying. The first rule of galactic monitoring was simple. When a world goes quiet, you investigate carefully. The second rule was even more important. When a world goes quiet, without warning, you call for help before you investigate. Vextha had seen enough dead worlds to know the difference between technical problems and something much worse. He sent emergency signals to every major civilization in the sector. The response was immediate and predictable. The Zephyrians, who had originally settled New Kepler, demanded immediate action. The Council of 5 wanted careful study before any movement. The Stellar Federation suggested waiting for more data. Only one response surprised him. Earth Defense Corps replied within hours. They would send a ship immediately. Captain Jake Morrison received the mission briefing while his ship, the Horizon, was docked at Mars Station. The message was short and direct. A farming world had gone silent. All 2 million people might be dead or worse. The other galactic powers were still arguing about what to do. Earth wanted humans to go and find out what happened. Morrison was 42 years old and had spent half his life in space. He had seen alien worlds that defied imagination and creatures that seemed impossible. But he had never encountered anything that could make an entire world go silent overnight. The challenge excited him more than it frightened him. His crew of 200 humans prepared for departure with typical efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Lisa Brooks packed her biological scanning equipment and started researching everything known about New Kepler. Chief Engineer Ben Parker checked every system on the ship twice. Communications Officer Kate Wilson made sure they could talk to anyone in the galaxy if needed. The journey to New Kepler took 7 days at maximum hyperspace speed. During that time, more reports came in from the monitoring stations. Every automated system on the planet was still working. The weather satellites showed normal patterns. The agricultural machines were still operating. But there were no life signs from any of the cities. Dr. Amy Chen, the ship's physicist, spent most of the journey studying the strange energy readings that were coming from the planet. Something was generating massive amounts of power down there, but the signatures were unlike anything in the human database. The readings seemed to pulse in a rhythm that reminded her of a heartbeat. When the Horizon finally dropped out of hyperspace near New Kepler, the crew saw a world that looked almost normal from orbit. Green fields stretched across the continents. Cities sparkled in the sunlight. Rivers flowed in their proper courses. Everything appeared peaceful and beautiful, but the scanning equipment told a different story. Lisa Brooks ran biological scans 3 times before she believed the results. There were life forms on the planet, but they were wrong somehow. The signatures were too strong, too organized, too uniform. It was as if every living thing on the planet had been changed into something else. Morrison ordered the ship into a careful orbit while his science team gathered more data. They found the cities empty but undamaged. The farming equipment was still working, but there were no farmers. Most disturbing of all, they found huge crystal structures in the center of every major population center. These crystals had not been there in any previous reports about New Kepler. The crystals were beautiful and terrible at the same time. They rose from the ground like frozen lightning, reaching toward the sky with dozens of sharp points. Each one was the size of a building and glowed with soft blue light. The energy readings that Amy Chen had detected during their journey were coming from these structures. Ben Parker volunteered to lead the first landing party. He chose a site near the smallest crystal, hoping it would be safer than approaching the larger ones. His team of 20 Marines and scientists prepared for anything they might find on the surface. As their landing craft descended through New Kepler's atmosphere, Kate Wilson tried one more time to contact any survivors who might be hiding somewhere on the planet. Her message was broadcast on every frequency that intelligent life was known to use. The response came immediately, but it was not what anyone expected. The crystal structures began to glow brighter. All of them across the entire planet started pulsing in perfect synchronization. The energy readings that Amy Chen was monitoring suddenly doubled, then tripled. Something down there had heard Kate's message and was responding to it. Morrison realized that his crew had just made contact with whatever had taken the people of New Kepler. The question was whether they had awakened, something that had been sleeping or something that had been waiting. Ben Parker stepped out of the landing craft onto the surface of New Kepler and immediately knew something was very wrong. The air smelled different, charged with energy like the moments before a lightning storm. The grass beneath his feet was too green, too perfect, as if someone had painted it rather than letting it grow naturally. The crystal structure loomed 50 meters away, taller than any building he had ever seen. Its surface was smooth like glass, but seemed to move slightly when he was not looking directly at it. The blue light that glowed from within pulsed faster now that humans were nearby, as if it sensed their presence. Parker's team spread out in a defensive formation around the landing zone. Marine Sergeant Tony Rodriguez kept his weapon ready while Dr. Lisa Brooks took readings with her biological scanner. The device made angry beeping sounds that she had never heard before. She looked at the scanner's display and felt her blood turn cold. According to the readings, there were thousands of life forms inside the crystal structure, but they were not alive in any way that made sense. The signatures showed brain activity without bodies, consciousness without physical form. It was impossible, but the scanner did not lie. Parker approached the crystal slowly, his boots crunching, on grass that sounded like it was made of metal. The closer he got, the brighter the crystal became. When he was just a few steps away, he could see shapes moving inside the structure. They looked like people, but they were made of light and shadow instead of flesh and bone. He reached out with one gloved hand and touched the crystal's surface. The moment his fingers made contact, everything changed. Light exploded from every crystal on the planet. The glow was so bright that it could be seen from orbit, where Captain Morrison watched in horror as New Kepler suddenly blazed like a small sun. The energy readings that Amy Chen was monitoring went completely off her instruments. Whatever had been sleeping inside those crystals was now wide awake. On the surface, Parker felt electricity run through his body as soon as he touched the crystal, but it did not hurt him. Instead, it felt like someone was trying to read his mind, searching through his thoughts and memories like pages in a book. He tried to pull his hand away, but found that he could not move. Then something spoke to him, not with words, but by placing thoughts directly into his head. The voice was ancient and vast, like the sound an ocean might make if it could talk. "Interesting," the voice said. "You are not like the others. Your thoughts taste different." "What are you?" Parker tried to answer, but before he could form the words, more beings began to emerge from the crystal. They were tall, perhaps 3 meters in height, and seemed to be made of living crystal and dark energy. They moved through the air rather than walking, flowing like water through space itself. These were the Harvesters, though Parker did not know their name yet. They had been sleeping in their processing centers, digesting the consciousness they had absorbed from New Kepler's population. The touch of human thought had awakened them because it was unlike anything they had ever encountered before. Lisa Brooks watched in amazement as the beings surrounded Parker. Her scanner was going crazy, detecting life forms that existed in ways that should not be possible. She tried to call for help, but her radio was not working. The energy from the crystals was interfering with all their equipment. More harvesters appeared from other crystals across the planet. They moved toward the human landing site with purpose, drawn by curiosity about these strange new minds they had detected. For billions of years, they had fed on the consciousness of different species, but human thoughts were proving to be unlike anything in their vast experience. Tony Rodriguez ordered his Marines to form a protective circle around the science team, but their weapons seemed useless against beings made of energy and crystal. The harvesters did not appear hostile, but they were clearly studying the humans like interesting specimens in a laboratory. One of the largest harvesters approached Parker, who was still frozen in place with his hand against the crystal surface. This being was different from the others, older and more complex. When it spoke, all the humans could hear its voice in their minds. "I am the one you would call a leader," it said. "We have consumed the thoughts and memories of countless species across this galaxy, but your minds are structured differently. They resist our feeding process. This has never happened before." Amy Chen, monitoring from orbit, detected massive energy surges coming from crystal structures all across the planet. It appeared that the harvesters were awakening everywhere, not just at the landing site. Something about human presence was triggering a planet-wide response. Captain Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of ordering his people to retreat, he decided to attempt communication. He had Kate Wilson broadcast a message directly to the crystal structures, speaking in clear, simple language. "We are humans from Earth." Morrison's voice carried across the planet's surface through every speaker in Parker's landing party equipment. "We came here looking for the people who lived on this world. We do not want to fight. We want to understand what happened to them." The response was immediate and terrifying. Every harvester on the planet turned their attention toward the orbiting ship. Morrison could feel their minds reaching out, trying to touch his thoughts across the vast distance of space. The sensation was like having someone walk through his memories without permission. But something unexpected happened. The harvesters found that they could not fully access human consciousness. Human minds were too chaotic, too filled with contradictions and impossible thoughts. Every time they tried to feed on human consciousness, it slipped away from them like trying to hold water in their hands. The leader of the harvesters spoke again, and this time there was something like confusion in its ancient voice. "Your species thinks in patterns we cannot process," it said. "You hold opposing ideas at the same time. You believe in things that cannot be proven. You hope for things that cannot happen. This should not be possible, yet you exist. You are immune to our feeding process." Parker finally managed to pull his hand away from the crystal surface. He staggered backward, his mind reeling from the contact. But he was still himself, still human, still alive. The harvesters had tried to consume his consciousness and failed. Lisa Brooks realized what this meant. The human crew had just discovered something that no other species in the galaxy had ever managed. They had found a way to resist the harvesters' power. The question was whether this immunity would save them or make them even more interesting to these ancient beings. The harvesters had never encountered a problem they could not solve by consuming it. For over 1 billion years, they had moved through the galaxy like a force of nature, feeding on the consciousness of entire civilizations. Every species they had met followed the same pattern. First contact, then confusion, then paralysis, then absorption into their collective consciousness. It was simple and efficient, and had never failed. Until now. Ben Parker stood in the middle of 20 harvesters, and felt their frustration like a physical weight in the air. They circled around him and his team, trying different approaches to accessing human thoughts. Some attempted direct mental contact. Others tried to induce the paralysis that normally preceded feeding. A few even tried to physically merge with human consciousness through touch. Nothing worked. Human minds remained stubbornly separate and indigestible. Tony Rodriguez watched his Marines as the harvesters experimented on them. Private Jake Walsh stood perfectly still while 3 of the beings tried to absorb his consciousness. Instead of the usual screaming and collapse that marked successful feeding, Walsh just looked annoyed. He kept muttering about wanting to get back to the ship for dinner. Dr. Lisa Brooks made the first crucial discovery while studying the failed feeding attempts. Her biological scanner showed that human brain activity actually increased when the harvesters tried to feed. Instead of shutting down, human consciousness seemed to fight back, generating new thoughts faster than the ancient beings could process them. She realized that human minds were fundamentally different from every other species the harvesters had encountered. Most intelligent life developed along predictable patterns with organized thoughts and logical mental structures. Humans were chaos. They could hold completely opposite ideas at the same time without going insane. They could believe in impossible things and make them real through sheer determination. This chaos was poison to the harvesters. Their feeding process required organized, structured consciousness that could be easily categorized and absorbed. Human thoughts were too wild, too contradictory, too unpredictable. Every time they tried to feed on a human mind, it was like trying to drink from a fire hose while riding a roller coaster. The leader of the harvesters, growing more frustrated, by the moment decided to try a different approach. Instead of attempting to feed on individual humans, it would try to absorb the entire landing party at once. Surely combined human consciousness would be easier to process than the chaotic thoughts of single individuals. It was the worst mistake the harvesters had made in 1,000,000 years. When the leader attempted mass absorption, it accidentally created a feedback loop. Human consciousness, instead of being consumed, began flowing back into the harvester collective. Parker felt his mind suddenly connected to a vast network of absorbed thoughts and memories from thousands of species. But instead of being overwhelmed, his human stubbornness kicked in. He began pushing back. Parker's memories of Earth, of human history, of countless wars where humans refused to surrender even when facing impossible odds, began flooding into the harvester collective. His thoughts of human creativity, human humor, human love, and human defiance spread like a virus through their shared consciousness. For the first time in their existence, the harvesters experienced something they had never felt before. Fear. Other humans felt the connection too. Lisa Brooks found herself sharing her memories of human scientific achievement with ancient minds that had never encountered a species that learned by questioning everything. Tony Rodriguez shared his experiences of human military tactics with beings who had never needed to fight because feeding was always effortless. Kate Wilson, still orbiting the planet in the horizon, detected massive energy fluctuations coming from all the crystal structures. Something was happening to the harvesters, and it was spreading across their entire network. She managed to establish communication with underground caverns where she detected life signs that might be survivors. The response came from a group of Zephyrians who had been hiding in deep caves since the harvesters arrived. Their leader, a scientist named Kethvar, spoke in broken galactic standard through an old emergency transmitter. The legends spoke of this day, Kethvar said. Ancient stories told of a species that would come from the outer rim, a people whose thoughts would poison the harvesters. We never believed the stories were real, but you are here. You are the chaos bringers our ancestors prophesied. Amy Chen, analyzing the data from orbit, realized what was happening. Human consciousness was not just resistant to harvester feeding, it was actively harmful to them. Every human thought that entered their collective consciousness created disruption and confusion. The more they tried to process human minds, the more damage they did to themselves. On the surface, the harvesters began to retreat from the human landing party, but it was too late. The connection had been made, and human thoughts continued to spread through their network like an infection. Parker could feel their ancient certainty crumbling as they encountered human concepts they could not understand or categorize. How could a species believe in individual freedom while also being willing to die for their community? How could they find humor in tragedy? How could they hope for better futures while fully understanding how terrible the present? Was? These contradictions made no sense to minds that had spent eons organizing and cataloging consciousness. The leader of the harvesters made one final attempt to understand what was happening. It opened a direct communication channel with Captain Morrison, speaking through the ship's communication system with a voice that shook with something that might have been panic. "What are you?" it demanded. "We have consumed the thoughts of species that spanned galaxies. We have absorbed the memories of civilizations that existed for millions of years. But your minds are chaos. They cannot be processed. They cannot be categorized. They cannot be controlled. This should not be possible." Morrison's response was simple and human. "We're stubborn," he said. "We don't like being told what to do, especially by something trying to eat our thoughts. And we really don't like bullies who pick on farming communities." The harvester leader fell silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note that no member of its species had ever experienced before. "Uncertainty. You have broken something that has worked for longer than your species has existed," it said. "We do not know how to process this. We do not know what to do with you. You are indigestible." Parker, still connected to their collective consciousness, felt something that surprised him. The harvesters were not evil. They were simply following their nature like any predator. They had never encountered prey that could fight back effectively. The concept of resistance was as foreign to them as the concept of surrender was to humans. But now, they had a problem. Human consciousness was spreading through their network, and they did not know how to stop it. Captain Morrison knew that everything had changed when the first harvester ship appeared on his sensors. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of the horizon, and it moved through space in ways that defied every law of physics he understood. Within hours, more ships began arriving from across the galaxy, drawn by distress signals that the local harvesters were broadcasting on frequencies that human instruments could barely detect. Amy Chen worked frantically at her station, trying to understand the technology that allowed the harvester vessels to travel faster than anything in the known galaxy. Her instruments showed energy signatures that should not exist, matter arrangements that violated basic principles of science, and propulsion systems that seemed to bend space itself around their ships. But she also detected something else. The new arrivals were not coming to attack the humans. They were coming to investigate what had gone wrong with their feeding process. For the first time in their billion-year existence, the harvesters had encountered prey that was not just resistant to consumption, but actually harmful to consume. On the surface of New Kepler, Ben Parker remained connected to the harvester collective consciousness through his initial contact with the crystal structure. The experience was like being plugged into the galaxy's largest library, but a library where all the books were written in languages of pure thought and emotion. He could access the memories and experiences of thousands of species that the harvesters had absorbed over the eons. What he found there changed his understanding of everything. The harvesters were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were more like gardeners who had been tending the same field for so long that they had forgotten other ways of cultivation existed. They consumed consciousness because that was how they sustained themselves, the same way humans consumed food or breathed air. It was not malicious. It was simply their nature. But they were also dying. Parker could feel their desperation through the collective link. The harvesters had been so successful at feeding that they had nearly exhausted their food supply. Most of the galaxy's intelligent species had either been consumed or had fled to distant regions beyond their reach. They were facing starvation, and the arrival of humanity represented what they thought might be their salvation. Instead, humans were proving to be the opposite of salvation. Human consciousness was not just indigestible, it was actively toxic to their system. Every human thought that entered their collective made them weaker, more confused, less capable of processing the consciousness they had already absorbed. Dr. Lisa Brooks, studying the biological data from the crystal structures, made a discovery that would change everything. The consciousness that the harvesters had absorbed was not destroyed. It was stored, processed, and incorporated into their collective intelligence. Every being they had ever consumed was still alive inside their network, existing as pure thought and memory. This meant that the 2,300,000 people of New Kepler were still alive. They were trapped inside the Harvester Collective, but they were not dead. The same was true for countless other species across the galaxy. The Harvesters were not murderers. They were kidnappers on a cosmic scale. Kate Wilson established contact, with more Zephyrian survivors hiding in underground complexes across the planet. Their stories painted a picture of the Harvester invasion that was both terrifying and strangely gentle. The crystal beings had arrived without warning, but they had not destroyed anything. They had simply reached out with their consciousness absorbing abilities and taken the population. Buildings remained intact. Infrastructure continued to function. Even pets and livestock were left unharmed. The harvesters only consumed sentient consciousness, leaving everything else exactly as it was. It was the most polite apocalypse in galactic history. But the most important information came from Kethvar, the Zephyrian scientist who had been studying his people's ancient legends about the Chaos Bringers. According to the oldest stories, there would come a species whose thoughts were so wild and contradictory that they would break the harvester's feeding process. These Chaos Bringers would force the Ancient Ones to find a new way of existing. Morrison realized that humanity was facing a choice that would determine the fate of the entire galaxy. They could continue to resist the harvesters and slowly poison their collective consciousness until the ancient beings died of starvation and confusion, or they could try to find a different solution. The decision was made when Tony Rodriguez reported from the surface that the harvesters were beginning to release some of the consciousness they had absorbed. Unable to process human thoughts, their entire system was becoming unstable. Zephyrian minds that had been trapped for months were suddenly being expelled from the collective, returning to empty cloned bodies that the harvesters created as temporary storage. It was not intentional. The harvesters were losing control of their own feeding process because human consciousness was disrupting their ability to maintain the collective. They were literally vomiting up the minds they had consumed because they could not digest the human thoughts that were mixed in with everything else. Amy Chen detected massive energy spikes from crystal structures across the planet as more consciousness was forcibly expelled. The process was chaotic and dangerous. Some minds returned to bodies perfectly intact. Others came back confused and changed. A few did not make the transition successfully and were lost forever. Captain Morrison opened a communication channel to the Harvester leader and made an offer that surprised everyone, including himself. "We know you're dying," he said. "We know you've consumed most of the intelligent life in this galaxy, and you're running out of food. We also know that trying to consume human consciousness is poisoning your system. But maybe there's another way." The ancient being's response carried a note of desperate curiosity. "Speak your proposal, Chaos Bringer." "Instead of consuming consciousness, learn from it," Morrison said. "Humans are willing to share our thoughts and experiences voluntarily. We can teach you how to sustain yourselves through cooperation instead of consumption. But the price is that you have to give back everyone you've ever absorbed. All of them. Every consciousness in your collective must be freed." The silence that followed lasted for several minutes. Parker, still connected to the collective, could feel the harvesters debating among themselves in ways that involved concepts human language could not express. They were considering the impossible. After 1 billion years of feeding on other species, they were being asked to become something entirely different. Finally, the leader spoke again. "This has never been attempted. We do not know if it is possible. But we are dying as we are, and your chaos thoughts are accelerating our decline. We will consider your proposal. But first, you must prove that voluntary consciousness sharing can sustain us. Morrison looked at his crew and saw the same determination in their eyes that had carried humanity through countless impossible situations. They were about to attempt something that had never been tried in the history of the galaxy. They were going to teach ancient cosmic predators how to become something else entirely. The moment Captain Morrison volunteered to be the first human to share consciousness voluntarily with the Harvesters, everyone on his crew knew that he was either about to save the galaxy or destroy it. The ancient beings had never attempted to process willing consciousness before. Their entire feeding mechanism was designed around forced absorption of terrified, resistant minds. Morrison stood in the center of the largest crystal structure on New Kepler, surrounded by dozens of Harvesters who watched him with something that might have been nervousness. Ben Parker remained connected to their collective, serving as a translator between human thoughts and Harvester understanding. The connection allowed him to feel their ancient uncertainty as they prepared for something they had never tried before. The Harvester leader approached Morrison slowly, its crystalline form shifting between solid matter and pure energy. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of eons of experience and the tremor of unprecedented doubt. "We have consumed the consciousness of millions of beings across countless worlds," it said, "but we have never encountered willing participation. Your thoughts may destroy us or transform us. We do not know which outcome is more likely." Morrison smiled in the way that only humans could when facing impossible odds. "That's the fun part," he said. "Neither do we. But we're going to find out together." The process began differently than any feeding the Harvesters had ever attempted. Instead of reaching out to forcibly absorb Morrison's consciousness, they created a bridge of shared thought that allowed voluntary connection. Morrison felt his mind expanding as it touched the vast network of absorbed consciousness that made up the Harvester collective. What he found there was beyond anything he had imagined. The collective was not just a storage system for consumed minds. It was a living library of every experience, every memory, every thought that the Harvesters had absorbed over their billion-year existence. Morrison could access the final moments of civilizations that had died before Earth's sun was born. He could experience the joy of species that had achieved incredible technological advancement before their consciousness was harvested. But he could also feel the Harvesters themselves. And what he discovered changed everything he thought he knew. About them, they were not evil. They were terrified. For eons, the Harvesters had sustained themselves by consuming other consciousness because they believed it was the only way they could survive. But they had never truly lived. They existed as a collective, sharing memories and experiences secondhand through the minds they had absorbed, but they had never created anything new. They had never grown or changed or learned beyond adding new consumed consciousness to their collection. They were the galaxy's oldest and most sophisticated parasites, but they were also its loneliest beings. Morrison realized that the Harvesters envied the species they consumed. Every civilization they absorbed had created art, music, literature, love, hope, and dreams that the ancient beings could experience but never truly understand. They were like beings who could see every color in the universe but had never learned to paint. Through the voluntary connection, Morrison began sharing something that the Harvesters had never encountered before: hope. Not the desperate hope of a dying civilization, but the casual, everyday hope of a species that believed tomorrow would be better than today, not because they had proof, but because they chose to believe it anyway. The effect on the Harvester collective was immediate and dramatic. Amy Chen, monitoring from orbit, detected massive energy fluctuations from crystal structures across the planet as Morrison's hope-filled consciousness spread through their network. But instead of the chaotic disruption that human thoughts usually caused, this voluntary sharing created something new. The harvesters began to remember what it felt like to create rather than consume. Ben Parker felt the change through his connection to the collective. Ancient minds that had spent millions of years simply cataloging and storing consciousness suddenly began generating new thoughts. They started to imagine possibilities beyond consumption. They began to dream of futures they could build instead of civilizations they could harvest. But the most profound change came when Morrison shared his memories of human failure and recovery. The harvesters accessed his thoughts about wars that humans had fought and learned from, mistakes that had led to growth, losses that had taught the value of what remained. They experienced humanity's fundamental belief that failure was not an ending, but a beginning, for beings who had never failed at anything because their feeding process had always worked perfectly. This concept was revolutionary. They realized that their success had trapped them in a cycle that prevented growth. They had become perfect at one thing and forgotten how to learn anything new. Lisa Brooks detected the first signs of what would later be called the Great Restoration, when consciousness began flowing out of the crystal structures in organized patterns rather than chaotic expulsions. The harvesters were not just releasing the minds they had absorbed, they were carefully returning them with new knowledge and capabilities gained during their time in the collective. Zephyrians, who had been farmers before absorption, returned with understanding of agricultural techniques from a dozen worlds. Scientists came back with knowledge of technologies that their original civilization had never imagined. Artists returned with inspiration drawn from the creative expressions of species across the galaxy. But the most important change was in the harvesters themselves. Through Morrison's voluntary sharing, they had learned that consciousness could be exchanged freely, that beings could choose to share their thoughts and experiences without being consumed. They discovered that voluntary cooperation created something greater than forced absorption ever could. The harvester leader, still connected to Morrison, spoke with a voice that carried wonder rather than ancient authority. "We have spent eons consuming the thoughts of others, but we have never truly thought for ourselves. Your willing participation has shown us something we did not know was possible. We can sustain ourselves through cooperation rather than consumption. We can grow rather than simply accumulate." Kate Wilson received communications from harvester ships throughout the galaxy reporting the same phenomenon. Everywhere the ancient beings had maintained crystal processing centers, consciousness was being restored to physical form. Entire civilizations that had been consumed over the past few centuries were being returned to life, enhanced by knowledge gained from other species, but fundamentally unchanged. Tony Rodriguez, leading security for the ground operations, watched as the planet transformed around them. Crystal structures that had been processing centers began changing into something else entirely. The harvesters were rebuilding them as communication hubs, places where different species could come to share knowledge and experience voluntarily. Morrison, still connected to the collective, made one final discovery that would change the future of the galaxy. The harvesters were not unique. There were other ancient species scattered across the universe, beings who had evolved beyond the need for physical form, but had become trapped in their own cycles of existence. The voluntary consciousness sharing that humans had introduced could free them all. When Morrison finally disconnected from the collective, he was still himself, but he carried with him the memories and perspectives of 1 billion years of galactic history. The harvesters had given him knowledge freely in exchange for the hope and creativity he had shared with them. The ancient beings had learned to give rather than take, and in doing so, they had discovered what it truly meant to live. 6 months after first contact with the harvesters, the galaxy looked completely different. Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Harmony Station, watching as ships from dozens of civilizations arrived for the first Galactic Cooperation Summit. The station itself was a marvel of combined technology, built using harvester energy manipulation techniques and human engineering principles working together. The transformation had not been easy or perfect. Restoring consciousness to billions of beings across hundreds of worlds had created challenges that no one had anticipated. Some individuals returned from the collective with memories that did not belong to them. Others came back with abilities that their original species had never possessed. A few had been so changed by their time in the Harvester network that they chose to remain as pure consciousness rather than return to physical form. But they were alive, and they were free. And that was what mattered most. Ben Parker, now serving as the head of Human Harvester Relations, had become something unprecedented in galactic history. His continued connection to the collective allowed him to serve as a permanent bridge between human consciousness and the ancient beings who were still learning how to exist without consuming other minds. The process had changed him in ways that he was still discovering, but he remained fundamentally human. The Harvesters themselves had undergone the most dramatic transformation. They no longer called themselves by their old name, which had become associated with consumption and fear. Instead, they had chosen to be known as the Gardeners, reflecting their new role as cultivators of consciousness rather than consumers of it. Dr. Amy Chen had spent months working with Gardner quantum engineers to develop new technologies that could sustain them through voluntary consciousness sharing rather than forced absorption. The breakthrough had come when they realized that freely given thoughts and experiences contained far more energy than forcibly taken ones. A single hour of willing cooperation could provide the same sustenance as days of forced feeding. The science behind it was still not fully understood, but the results were undeniable. The Gardeners were not just surviving on voluntary sharing, they were thriving in ways they never had before. For the first time in their existence, they were growing and learning and creating new ideas rather than simply cataloging the thoughts of others. Lisa Brooks had become the galaxy's leading expert on consciousness restoration. Her work helping absorbed beings transition back to physical form had saved millions of lives and had earned her recognition from every major civilization in the galaxy. But her most important discovery had been that the restoration process could be used to help other species as well. Beings who had been damaged by war, disease, or accident could have their consciousness healed using techniques learned from the Gardeners. The Zephyrians had been among the first to benefit from the new alliance. Their people, restored from the collective with knowledge gained from dozens of other species, had transformed their agricultural world into a center of learning and cultural exchange. Kethvar, the scientist whose people had preserved the ancient legends about Chaos Bringers, now served as the director of the Galactic Archive, where the memories and experiences of every species were being cataloged and preserved for future generations. Captain Morrison had been offered positions with a dozen different galactic organizations, but he had chosen to remain with Earth Defense Corps, while also serving as the first human ambassador to the Gardner Collective. The role required him to split his time between traditional space exploration and the unprecedented work of helping ancient cosmic beings learn how to be part of a galactic community rather than predators feeding on it. The challenges were immense. There were still Gardner factions who struggled with the concept of voluntary cooperation. Some younger members of the collective had never known anything except consumption and found it difficult to adapt to their new existence. A few had attempted to return to their old feeding methods, creating diplomatic incidents that required careful resolution, but the successes far outweighed the problems. The Gardeners had shared technological advances that accelerated every civilization's development by centuries. They had provided historical knowledge that helped species understand their own origins and potential. Most importantly, they had proven that even the most fundamental nature could be changed through choice and determination. Kate Wilson had established the Galactic Communication Network, using Gardner technology to create instantaneous contact between civilizations across the galaxy. For the first time in history, species separated by thousands of light years could share ideas and experiences in real time. The network had already prevented 3 wars and facilitated countless scientific collaborations. Tony Rodriguez had found his calling training security forces for the new age of galactic cooperation. The techniques he developed for protecting voluntary consciousness-sharing sessions had become standard practice across the galaxy. His Marines had evolved from simple soldiers into guardians of a new kind of peace, one based on mutual understanding, rather than military deterrence. But perhaps the most important change was in humanity's role in the galaxy. The species that had once been considered a curiosity from the outer rim was now recognized as the catalyst that had transformed everything. Human stubbornness, creativity, and refusal to accept that things could not be changed had become legendary throughout the galaxy. The distress signal that had started everything had become a symbol of hope. When other galaxies sent desperate messages about their own harvester-like threats, it was the alliance between humans and gardeners that responded. Together, they had developed techniques for converting consciousness-consuming species into consciousness-cultivating ones. The process was not always successful. Some ancient predator species were too set in their ways to change. Others chose destruction rather than transformation. But enough had been converted that the threat of cosmic-scale consciousness consumption was becoming a thing of the past. Morrison stood at the observation window, watching as a Gardner ship gracefully docked with Harmony Station. The vessel was beautiful, constructed from living crystal that shifted between transparency and opacity as it moved. Inside were beings who had once been the galaxy's most feared predators, and were now its most dedicated protectors. Dr. Amy Chen joined him, at the window carrying a data pad filled with reports from across the galaxy. "The latest statistics are in," she said. "Consciousness restoration is now 97% successful. Voluntary sharing programs are operating on over 400 worlds. And we just received our first request for assistance from the Andromeda Galaxy." Morrison smiled as he watched. Human children playing with young gardeners in the station's recreation area. The ancient beings who had never experienced childhood because they had always existed as collective consciousness were learning about growth and development through interaction with human families who had volunteered to share their experiences. "You know what the best part is?" Morrison said. "We're not done yet. Every day we find new ways to help species work together instead of consuming each other. The universe is bigger than we ever imagined, and it's full of possibilities we haven't even dreamed of yet." Ben Parker's voice came through the station communication system, carrying news that would have been impossible to believe a year earlier. "Attention all personnel. We have confirmation that the consciousness restoration of the Andorian Empire is complete. 2 billion beings have been successfully returned to physical form, and their leaders have requested to join the Galactic Cooperation Alliance." The galaxy had learned something that would have seemed impossible before humanity arrived. The most dangerous enemy could become the most powerful ally if someone was stubborn enough to believe that change was possible and brave enough to try to make it happen. Humans had not conquered the Harvesters through superior technology or military might. They had defeated them by being impossibly, stubbornly, irrepressibly human, and in doing so, they had taught an ancient species how to become something better than they had ever imagined possible.